So thanks for joining us today. I know it was a particularly difficult time. I like, snurlo.
Yeah, I don't like that. I'm just going to put that out there.
You don't like that?
No.
So it's a snow day and a furlough, and it definitely made life more interesting in the planning of the event. And we're really thankful you came.
Well, listen, thank you for having this discussion. I realize we've got the government shut down, more snow than Washington can handle, and also a big hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee this morning. And so while there were a few forces working against you, I do think that if we have a conversation about bipartisan technology policy, I think people in Washington should pay attention. And this was a terrific way to get that conversation started. So thank you for holding this.
Well, thank you so much. And I will say the panels today are pretty outstanding.
Totally agree.
It's going to be a really great day.
It gets better from here after me.
So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about each of the three topics that we will be talking about today. So I'm going to start with rural broadband. So Pew suggests that for 58% of Americans, access is an issue in rural America. What thoughts do you have about how we might be able to support a solution for folks in that community?
This is really important because in too many places in this country, opportunity feels like it's out of reach. And in a lot of those locations, getting access to broadband's a problem. So what do we do about it? Well, I think the first thing you do is you have to look at what the numbers tell us. And the FCC data suggests that there are 24 million Americans without access to broadband, the bulk of them in rural areas. But here's the thing. Last month in the New York Times, there was a report of a study that found that 162 million Americans do not access the internet at broadband speed. Now, you don't have to do the math, but there's a big delta between 162 and 24. And we've got to figure out what's going on. I don't think you can manage problems that you do not measure. And right now, our broadband measurement is woefully inadequate. Our wired maps still use a methodology that we were using a decade ago. A single subscriber in a neighborhood indicates that there's service throughout. Our lived experience tells us that's not true. Likewise, we've got wireless broadband maps that don't reflect what service consumers get on the ground. I mean, there are too many places in this country where they're not talking about 5G, they have no G. So what we have to do, first and foremost, is commit to a nationwide effort to improve our understanding of where broadband is and is not. And on that score, I think there are so many things we can do that we're not doing today. Just asking industry to tell us where service is a starting point. We've got to get the American population participating in this. We all know where service fades. We all know where it's not precisely what a map suggests. How do we use crowdsourcing? How do we use the 12 dozen FCC field offices to test where service is? We've got a speed app that's been downloaded 200,000 times. With that comes data about where service is and is not. We've got to figure out what federal infrastructure exists out there, like postal trucks that traverse rural roads, and use them to tell us where service is and is not. I think if we can get a more accurate read of where we have broadband and where we do not, we're going to be able to direct our scarce resources more effectively and reach more people in more places.
Thank you. So I recently spent some time at the Indigenous Connectivity Summit, and we were in the Arctic Circle. This was put on by the Internet Society. It gave me an absolutely new understanding of what rural is. And so thinking about our Indigenous communities, especially those that are incredibly rural and hard to reach, what kinds of things should we be thinking about and doing in order to support better connectivity?
Wow, so you were somewhere near the Arctic Circle?
I was in the Arctic. I put my hand in the Arctic Ocean. I really did.
I'm assuming it was cold.
It was. It was, but it was amazingly beautiful.
Oh, gosh. We have got some places where rural almost doesn't do justice to how remote it is. Particularly some regions of Alaska, but there are others in the contiguous 48. And many of those locations include tribal communities. We have long-standing problems getting modern communication service to those communities, and it's apparent that what we've done in the past has been inadequate. We need new plans going forward. But thankfully, Congress, in the Ray Baums Act, actually asked the FCC to do an assessment of tribal broadband and tribal communications. And that is, I believe, due to Congress in the next several months. I think that's a starting point for action. We're going to have to figure out not just how to come up with policy, but how to engage our tribal communities in the development of that policy. And we should use that report as a starting point.
Thank you. So you've also championed the plight of students, both in rural and urban areas, who can't access the internet. And sometimes it's because it's not available, and sometimes it's because it's unaffordable. And so as a former teacher and a principal, you know this matters to me. And you coined the term homework gap, and you've really focused a lot of energy on this. What kinds of things can and should we be doing in order to ensure that our children have access to do the work they need to do to be successful in school?
Ah, so important. I like to say when I was growing up, all I needed for homework was paper, a pencil, and my brother leaving me alone. And you know that third one was the hardest part. Today, that's just not true. 7 in 10 teachers assign homework that requires internet access. But FCC data, time and time again, show that 1 in 3 households do not have it. And where those numbers overlap is what I call the homework gap. And according to the Senate Joint Economic Committee, it's real. There are 12 million students all across this country, in urban areas and rural areas, who do not have reliable access to the internet to do basic schoolwork. To me, that is the cruelest part of the digital divide, and it's on us to fix it. Again, it's not a problem that's unique to urban America or rural America. It's all of us. So we should be able to develop a solution, because it's not good enough if kids are sliding into fast food restaurants and doing their homework nightly with a bunch of fries. It's not good enough if parents have to cobble together getting their kids to libraries with short hours and friends and relatives' houses just to be able to get them online. When I was in New Mexico, I'll never forget, we met a student who was on the school football team who would sit in the parking lot after games late at night in the pitch black, because it was the only reliable place that he could get for a signal to do his schoolwork. I just think in 21st century America, we can do better than that. And there's so many things we're not doing, but we could do. We could think about putting Wi-Fi on school buses. And in fact, there's bipartisan legislation in the Senate contemplating just that. It helps turn ride time, particularly in rural Americas, into connected time for homework. We should be looking at how to update FCC programs. We should be looking at how to support companies when they make low-cost service available. How do we publicize it so that every student and their family is aware of it? How do we come up with more libraries that have Wi-Fi loaners? Those puck-sized devices can make a huge difference. And then, if you permit me to be deeply wonky for a second, I think there's a spectrum band that can make a real difference. Back in 1960, when President Kennedy was running for office, he talked at length about the educational power of television, that it could reach us all in places where schools might not be available. And if you go back and look at that language, it's just stunning, because in many ways it replicates what we do when we talk about the internet today. But then President Kennedy appointed Newton Minow as his chairman of the FCC, who is probably best known for his statement that television is a vast wasteland. So there's a little cognitive dissonance between campaigning and governing there. But shortly after he was appointed, he set aside spectrum known as instructional television fixed service. That was in the 2.5 gigahertz band. And back in the 60s, that spectrum was like in Siberia. Nobody thought about using it, so they handed it out to educational institutions to see if they could do things with those airwaves. Not much developed. And so in 2004, the FCC decided the thing that they should do is make it available for broadband, but more importantly, they would rename it. In grand bureaucratic fashion, we decided to call it the Educational Broadband Service. But in fact, many of those institutions that have those licenses are not using it for broadband for their students directly. So the question is, what can we do? Well, here's my idea. We have a bunch of licenses in the 2.5 gigahertz band in inventory. If we take those and combine them with a voluntary incentive auction for the return of some of those old licenses, and then auction them off for new broadband use for 5G purposes, we would have a revenue pool that we could use to help support homework gap. That would be a way to make spectrum available for 5G purposes and also address the homework gap by creating a fund for more Wi-Fi devices, Wi-Fi on school buses, lots of good things. I think there is a win-win solution in that, and I think the agency should explore it.
Thank you. I was going to go there, educational broadband service. But let's skip to privacy now, if you don't mind. So how can consumers better understand the way their data is collected and the protections that they have? And when I think about this, I often think that there is a certain luxury that people who have money have around how they choose to keep their data private. But if you do not have money, you often don't have that luxury. But helping people understand it, I think, is a high priority.
Oh, I totally agree. You know, when we talk about data and privacy and principles we should all agree on as we try to develop policies, we often talk about transparency. You should know what's happening. We talk about choice. We should consent to certain behaviors, not have them assumed. And then we talk about notification in the case of breaches. I think all those values are really important. And there's an emerging consensus that those should be the things we talk about in new data privacy laws. But I think what's missing in there is simplicity. We all live busy lives. We access lots of services. And I just don't think you need to be an engineer to figure out what's being done to your data, and you shouldn't have to be a lawyer to know if your information's being protected. We've got to find a way to make it simple for us to be good consumers in a competitive marketplace. So as we move towards a more robust discussion of data privacy, possibly new legislation, I think it's imperative that simplicity is part of the discussion.
Good point, thanks. So we've seen several approaches to comprehensive privacy legislation, including the California privacy law and GDPR. Are there any elements from these frameworks that you think could be applied to national comprehensive policy?
Oh, this is where I say this is above my pay grade. But I do think the California Consumer Privacy Act and GDPR will put pressures on Washington to develop a comprehensive framework. And I think those pressures are good. I think we've got to update our laws for the digital age. And I am cautiously optimistic that Washington will be able to do that this Congress.
We hope so. So just because we're going to run out of time soon, I want to ask you a couple of things about spectrum, which you talk a lot about. So how can we make efficient use of our limited spectrum resources? That is, how do we create abundance from scarcity using good policy?
Such a big question, but it's also so important. The thing that strikes me most about our spectrum policy historically is that it's got this binary quality. On the one hand, you have exclusive use licenses, where through auction you might purchase it and you can use it and nobody else. And on the other hand, we have unlicensed use, which most of us think of as Wi-Fi, where we can all use it if we abide by some basic rules of the road. And the thing that strikes me most is that we're creating some scarcity when we limit ourselves to that binary model. The question is, how can we be more creative with this scarce resource so that we produce more abundant possibility? And I think you see the start of that in the FCC's work in the 3.5 gigahertz band. Leaving aside the specifics about license size and duration, what we did there is truly unique. Instead of saying you're licensed or unlicensed, we created a hierarchy of rights where we have a preemptive federal use. So if federal defense authorities need it, they get it, no questions asked. But then we're licensing secondary uses. And to the extent that those exclusive licenses are not being used, we're going to make unlicensed use for services like Wi-Fi. And I think in that kind of system of hierarchies, what we see emerging are new possibilities for abundance. So I think that is the band to watch for the future of spectrum policy.
Okay, and my final question. Everybody's obviously excited about the concept of 5G applications and services. How do you look at the different spectrum puzzle pieces that need to come together for people to have seamless connectivity wherever they are, at home, at work, at play? How do we find a way to make that happen?
Oh, that's not a short question. It's got a big answer. First, we're going to have to spend a lot of time moving spectrum to market. That makes a difference. And I think on mid-band spectrum, the FCC is behind some of our, some other economies in the world, and we're going to have to move faster on that. We're also going to have to figure out how to get facilities deployed. By some counts, we're going to need 800,000 small cells by 2026 to make sure that 5G is ubiquitous. We're going to have to figure out how to make sure state and local actors are our partners in the process. That's the quickest way we know to expedite deployment. We've got work to do on that. And then finally, I think it's on all of us who get excited about beamforming and antenna arrays and the possibilities of millimeter wave to find some other ways to talk about 5G. What can it really do for you? And I realize that we're all trying to dream up things, but I think it's on us to find some use cases that are compelling. What can we do with healthcare monitoring that will make people more well, at lower cost, and more comfortable? What can we do with our cities, with traffic, that would reduce average commute times? I think 5G is a little too abstract, and we're going to have to work on some use cases to demonstrate its true possibilities, to make sure that enthusiasm is more widespread beyond those of us who think that, you know, new antennas and software-defined transmitters are really exciting.
Well, if it could help with snow removal.
We're going to have to think about that.
Now, are you okay to take a couple of questions? Or do
Sure.
Okay. So if we could take a couple of questions from the audience. Do we have any?
We have a live stream question. Is this working? Someone on Twitter wants to know, where do state governments come into play in the broadband equation?
I think that we are not in Washington interacting adequately with state and local governments when it comes to broadband. I think our idea that we can sit here in Washington and figure out where service is and is not is foolhardy. We're going to have to figure out how to make sure we use their intelligence and their resources in the equation, and that is a place where we have obvious room for improvement.
Thank you, and you know that makes those of us who work with local government very happy to hear.
So on that particular, for local governments, where's the flexibility to utilize their assets and to do that at full market rate rather than have that limited from the top down by DC?
Okay, there's a lot of ways. That's a great question. There's a lot of ways to talk about that. I think one of the more disturbing facts right now is that we've got a lot of state legislatures that have constrained local governments. I mean, the way I look at it, it's the most American thing in the world to say, hey, this isn't working. How does my community pull together and make something happen? That's how we built bridges, barns. That's how we electrified the countryside. And I think in those areas of the country where we do not have adequate service and the digital age is passing us by, we've got to make sure that people feel that they can make this happen themselves. And to me, that's something that deserves focus.
One more question. We have one in the back.
Thank you. Do you think it's more cumbersome or easier to implore schools to bridge the digital divide by increasing their number of laptops and bettering their broadband or Wi-Fi service so that way, regardless of the socioeconomic status of their students, that all students can at least come to school and know that they can utilize laptops and take part in the digital economy?
This is an important question. Listen, we've got to prepare every student for the digital age. It's no longer adequate to hand them a textbook and expect that they're going to have skills for the 21st century workforce. And schools across the country with E-rate, with other programs, are making an effort to wire their facilities so that students have access while on campus and in school. I think the growing challenge now is making sure those students have the access they need when they're outside of school. And due to the lack of availability of service, the cost of service, and a whole bunch of other factors, 12 million students fall into a homework gap without that access. And I think that is a part of the digital divide that we can and should address. So I think we're going to have to do all of the above to make this happen. And I think we've got to take notes. There are a lot of schools doing very creative things around the country, loaning out Wi-Fi hotspots, building maps of where Wi-Fi is available in town, working with providers to make sure that low-cost service plans are available to the families of their students. We're going to have to promote all of these in order to solve this problem.
Okay, I hope you will join me in thanking Commissioner Rosenworcel for spending her morning with us.
Thank you.